Boker Tov. My name is Ruben, and thank you for being here this morning. What I want to talk about today is the name of the Messiah. I want to discuss the name of the Messiah. And as we go along here, I think some people are going to be shaken up a little bit by what I'm about to say. But you can verify what I'm going to say because, of course, it's all accurate. If you find something I ever say that you feel I'm misrepresenting or that I've taken out of context, please tell me that, and I'll definitely correct myself. I've done it over the last 30-some years. I found out I was wrong about a lot of things, and that's why we're sitting here today. I want to share with you the things the Almighty showed me, and like I said, if you find me misinterpreting in something, please let me know. Let me say this about the names here now. Let me first start out by saying the name Jesus, there was no letter J in any language on the face of the planet until the year 1520 AD. It's 1,520 years after the resurrection. Close. 1,520 years after the resurrection, roughly. So, but there was no letter J. That's the first time the letter J came into existence, is the year 1520 AD. In the 1611 King James Bible, over 100 years later, almost 100 years later, over 100 years later, the J was not of no prominent use. It was not being used at that time. Even 100 years later, it was still of not prominent use. And it's not contained in the King James Bible. There are no J's in the King James Bible. It doesn't exist. It didn't exist at that time. They didn't put it in there. Like I said, it was not a prominent use, even 100 years later, the letter J. Therefore, if what I'm saying is true, and it is, and I would encourage you to verify, of course, everything that I'm saying, if the letter J was not of any prominent use, then the name Jesus could not have been in the 1611 King James Bible. And that's a fact. It's not in there. I used to tell people you can go down to a Christian bookstore and get a facsimile of the 1611 Bible, the King James. You can either buy it or just go in there and take a look at it to verify that what I'm saying is true. But the name Jesus does not appear in the 1611 King James Bible. I realize that a lot of people have the 1611 Bible. They think they have the 1611 Bible, but you don't. What you have is probably the 23rd or 24th edition of the King James Bible, the 23rd, 24th edition of the King James Bible. You do not have the 1611. Like I said, in the 1611 King James, the name Jesus does not appear in there one single time. It doesn't exist because there was no letter J. So what would be found in there? The name Iesus. In the King James 1611, the name Iesus. They call the Messiah by the name Iesus. Again, that's supposed to be a transliteration of the Messiah's name Yahshua or Yehoshua. So they say they translated it from Yahshua in the Greek, and it came out Iesus. Whether that's true or not, in my opinion, is kind of up in the air. But in any case, it's not Jesus. The name Jesus does not appear in the 1611 Bible. That name didn't exist anywhere on the planet prior to the year 1520, and even after that, as we see in the 1611 Bible, it still doesn't appear even in there. So whether Iesus is a proper transliteration of the Hebrew name for the Messiah, Yahshua, Yehoshua, is, in my opinion, up in the air. I kind of don't see it myself. Because I think it was typical with nations and countries to ascribe the name of their Elohim, their mighty one, their, if you would, God, to the names of their citizens. Like in the Hebrew, for instance, the mighty one, the Elohim of Israel, is Yahweh, and it's a shortened form of his name is Yah or Yahu, Yahu. In Hebrew, it's Yahu, most of it with the U at the end of it. Most people just say Yah, like Zechariah. The end of the name Zechariah has ascribed the shortened form of the Elohim of Israel, whose name is Yahweh. Zechariah. It ends in Y-A-H. I realize most translations type it in there Y. How do they type it in there? I-A-H. But it's pronounced Zechariah, and more properly it'd be Y-A-H. It's a shortened form of the Elohim of Israel, the Heavenly Father Yahweh. And that's true with many nations. We're told in Micah, it says, all nations worship in the name of their Elohim. We worship Yahweh, our Elohim. So anyway, that's true. Jeremiah, we have Zechariah, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Y-A-H. They end in the name, the shortened form of the name of the Hebrew Elohim, Yahweh. And the same was true with the pagan nations. You know, Zeus in Greek mythology, not just in Greek mythology, but the Elohim that the Greeks worshipped was Zeus. As a matter of fact, one of the seven wonders of the world, you know, along with the Hanging Gardens of Babylon and the pyramids and the light tower at, where was the light tower at? I'm trying to think. The Temple of Diana at Ephesus. But the seven wonders of the world, one of the seven wonders of the world was a 43-foot statue of Zeus, the pagan Elohim Zeus. And it was built probably around 400 BCE, actually a little later than that. 400 BCE, before the Messiah, 400 years before the Messiah. And it was finally destroyed 400 years after the Messiah. This seven wonder of the world, Zeus, the statue of Zeus, existed for 800 years. Excuse me. Existed for 800 years. And it was worshipped, of course, by the pagans, by the Greeks. And it was a very prominent, Zeus is a very prominent figure in Greek mythology and the Greek civilization itself. So they ascribed the name of their Elohim, Zeus, to the ends of many of the Greek names. Zeus. And the name Zeus. Like I said, it's not a stretch, I don't believe, to see the name Zeus and the name Zeus. So did the Greeks, when they got a hold of the manuscripts, did they substitute the name of the Hebrew Messiah, Yahshua, and put their Elohim in there, the name of their Elohim, Zeus, in there? It sure sounds like it to me, Zeus. They say that Zeus in the Greek, which is in the, again, 1611 Bible for the name of the Messiah, they say that's a transliteration of the Hebrew name Yahshua. Transliteration, it's not a translation. Names are proper names, names and proper nouns, all proper nouns, are transliterated. They're not translated, they're transliterated. For instance, if you went to France, I don't speak French, but I'm going to almost guarantee you that if I go to France, I say Eiffel Tower, I'll bet in French it's still Eiffel Tower. Or Toyota, the Japanese manufacturer Toyota. I don't speak Japanese either, but I can almost guarantee you that if I go to Japan, the name is still Toyota. Or Boris Yeltsin. How would you say the name Boris Yeltsin or Vladimir Putin in Russian? I'm pretty confident it'd be Vladimir Putin or Boris Yeltsin. Names do not change. Names are transliterated. Transliterated means you bring them into the other language, keeping the pronunciation as close as you can possibly keep it. Yet there may be variations due to dialect and accents. For instance, a German. A German could not say Volkswagen. A true German would say Volkswagen, because he'd have a hard time, if he could do it at all, pronouncing the W. So he'd pronounce the W as a V. So if you were to transliterate a word and bring it into German, the W would probably turn into a V, not because the name's changing, but because of the accent. See what I'm saying? So in transliterating nouns and proper nouns, the key there is to keep the pronunciation as close to the original as you can, if the alphabets line up. All alphabets are not identical, of course. Some alphabets, our alphabet, English alphabet has 26 letters. I believe the Hebrew alphabet has 24. And they vary, alphabets vary. If an alphabet did not have an S sound in it or a sh sound in it, and of course you couldn't transliterate a name that had that sh sound in it, the SH sound in it, into that language, because there's no such letter in that language. And that does happen occasionally. And they say that was the case with the Greek alphabet. They say they couldn't transliterate the name Yahshua accurately into the Greek, so they came up with Zeus. And Zeus eventually evolved into Jesus. We know absolutely certain that Jesus is not the name, again, because the letter J did not exist. The Messiah never ever heard that name. Never heard that name. No one was ever called by that name. Like I said, the first time that letter ever came into existence was the year 1520. You can verify that for yourself. And like I mentioned about the nations ascribing the name of their deity or their Elohim or their God, if you will, to the names of their citizens and so forth. Turn, if you would, to Acts chapter 14. Acts chapter 14. I think this kind of backs up what I'm trying to say here a little bit. Acts chapter 14. And begin reading in verse 9. It says, this man was listening to Paul, and as he spoke, who when he had fixed his gaze upon him, and had seen that he had the faith to be made well, said with a loud voice, this is the Apostle Paul, stand upright on your feet. And he leaped up and began to walk. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they raised their voice, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The Elohim have become like men and have come down to us." And they began calling Barnabas Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. They began calling Barnabas Zeus. Zeus was the Greek Elohim, the mighty one of the Greeks for centuries. Like I said, the seventh wonder of the world was a 40-some-foot statue of Zeus built in the year 400 BCE, even later than that, and finally destroyed in the year 400 AD. It existed for over 800 years. It was a prominent thing in the land at that time, before the Messiah and after the Messiah. The Elohim of the Greeks, Zeus, was very revered, very worshipped, very much looked up to. And here we have them calling Barnabas Zeus. Why did they do that? Because what did they say? The Elohim have come down like men. That's what the pagans did. They would ascribe, they were always looking for a man to become the Almighty. That's just typical of the pagan nations. And here they were calling Barnabas Zeus, and Paul being the chief speaker, because that'd be another story, but I believe Paul was the chief speaker. Paul had the gift of tongues more than all men. He went initially back in Acts chapter, I think possibly right around here, 13 and 14, but when Barnabas went to Tarsus, he went back and got Paul. When Barnabas went to Antioch, he went back and got Paul and brought Paul to Tarsus with him. Now, why did he do that? It doesn't tell us, but I'm speculating that it might have been because Paul had the gift of tongues more than any man. He could speak Greek, obviously. We're told in the book of Acts he spoke Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic. He probably spoke Latin at that time, which was the language of the Romans. So Paul had the gift of tongues more than all men. So I'm speculating. Now, this is my opinion, but I think if we went through and looked at it, I think it's a good opinion, in my opinion. So Paul had the gift of tongues more than all men. So I'm thinking that Barnabas went and got Paul because he could translate. He could speak the language of the Greeks and the Latins and so forth. And that's why he's called the chief speaker here. And Barnabas, who was more or less at that time, Barnabas was an apostle more or less prior to Paul. Whether that's the case or not, it's all irrelevant. But Barnabas was called Zeus, and Paul was called Hermes because Paul was the chief speaker. But you see, the thing I wanted to bring out there was, you see what the pagans did? They right away, because of the miracle that Paul had done, they right away ascribed the name of their pagan Elohim, Zeus, to Barnabas and Hermes to Paul. That was typical. I mean, that was common of the pagans to do that. Did the Greeks do that when they got a hold of the manuscripts? The manuscripts of the writings of the apostles? Did they ascribe the name of Iesus? Somebody suggested the name Iesus means the healing Zeus. Again, I can't verify that. It's just something I've heard. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But it doesn't take a whole lot to see the name Zeus in there. And if that's an accurate translation, Iesus, of the Hebrew Yahshua, which it's supposed to be, we don't have to say it today. We don't have to say Iesus, and we surely shouldn't say Jesus, because we know that to be a fact that that's not the Messiah's name. You never heard that name. And I know there's some people out there, I've told people this in the past and having this conversation with others. Well, he knows who I'm talking about. It's true, he knows who you're talking about. He can see your heart. If somebody comes and tells you something that you're doing in relation to the Son of Elohim, to our Messiah, to our Savior, and they tell you that his name may his name Jesus may have been derived from the name of a pagan deity, Zeus, and you say, what does it matter? Who cares? He knows. Yes, he does know. And he can see that if what I'm telling you is true, and absolutely it is about the name Jesus not being his name, you can verify that very easily. I almost feel bad a lot of times when I say things like this, because I remember how I felt when somebody told me that. You know, years ago, maybe 27 years ago, somebody came to me and they said the Messiah never heard the name Jesus. And I remember saying to him something to the effect like, well, that's ridiculous. How could that be? His name's in the New Testament, writings of the apostles, which I referred to as the New Testament at that time. His name's in there over hundreds of times. And you're going to tell me every time is a mistake? No, I don't think so. Well, it took another year for the Almighty to send somebody in my life to explain it to me again. And I realized today that, like I'm telling you, the name Jesus didn't exist at that time. I didn't want to give it up, and I'm sure a lot of people don't want to give it up. But if it's true, we have to go with it. We have to go with the truth as the Almighty reveals it to us. And if you're using the name Jesus, he's revealing to you today that that's not the Messiah's name. You never heard that name. That name didn't exist in his day. As a matter of fact, it didn't even exist in the days of the 1611 King James Bible, as I mentioned. And you can go to a Christian bookstore, get a facsimile of the 1611, or buy it. I think they're about $25. Or just look at it, verify for yourself that that name did not exist in the 1611 Bible, let alone 1,500 years prior to that. Messiah never heard the name Jesus. As I mentioned, names are transliterated. I think I just mentioned that. They're brought into the language, keeping the pronunciation as close as you can. The Hebrew alphabet and the English alphabet are very, very similar, almost identical, but very similar. Many of the letters we have in the English alphabet, we have in the Hebrew alphabet. So that's very similar. So if we want to transliterate a name, we can translate it almost exactly. Bring the pronunciation in from one language to another almost exactly, if not exactly, as the name should be pronounced. As I mentioned, my name is Reuben. If I go to any nation on the earth, and they speak any of the hundreds of different languages on the earth, I believe there may be 140 different languages or dialects and so forth, possibly more. But what does my name become if I go to a country out in La La Land over here? Would Reuben become Michael or Shlomo, or it's Reuben? The name is Reuben. Like I mentioned, because names, dialects, and accents, somebody might pronounce it differently, but names should be transliterated, meaning you keep the pronunciation as close as you can. You don't translate names, they're transliterated. Okay, keeping that in mind, turn to Acts chapter 4:12, if you would. Acts chapter 4 and verse 12. Yeah, I've often said in the past, and there's no question in my mind, I was going to say I really believe this, but I'm certain of it because I've seen it over and over and over again. You know, a lot of things we're going to be looking at here in the scriptures. This is the word of Elohim here. This is the Almighty's word, the word of Yahweh. And I should be able to open this book up and say, this is what it says, and you should say, and I would say, yes, I believe that. That's what it says. That's not the case. We're going to see as we go along here in these talks, a lot of things that people believe, that you probably believe, a lot of you believe, are not biblical. They're not talked about in the Bible, any place. And yet people believe them because over the centuries of misguided information that people have, they've come to believe it. And what people typically say is, my mother believed that, my grandmother believed that, and I'll die believing that. Well, friend, that's up to you. But on Judgment Day, as I've mentioned in the past, you're going to be all there alone without your mother and your grandmother, or your husband, or your children, or anybody else. We'll be all alone on Judgment Day. And we're going to be based on the truth. We're going to be judged according to how we followed the truth, the way the Heavenly Father revealed it to us. But a lot of people, you can show them things in the book. It doesn't matter. They say they believe the book, but when you show them certain passages, no, I don't believe that. Well, I'm chomping at the bit to tell you a story about a pastor that I met, but we'll wait till we get to that subject. But I'm saying that in reference to Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12 here. Look what Peter says here. He's talking about the Messiah. And there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven that has been given among men by which we must be saved. There's no other name given among men under heaven by which we must be saved. Was that name Jesus? As I mentioned, the name Jesus did not exist and would not exist for another 1,520 years. It wasn't Jesus. That name wasn't around at that time. The Messiah was never called by that name. Never heard that name. What was the Messiah's name? I think everybody would agree that it's Yahshua, or Yehoshua, Yahshua. And we're going to prove that. And I think I mentioned earlier, if I didn't, in Amos chapter 3, verse 7, the Almighty says he reveals nothing except he reveals it through his prophets. Did he reveal the name of the Messiah to us through his prophets? Yes, he did. And we're going to take a look at that today. And you kind of have to follow along with this closely. It's not hard to see, I don't believe, but I'm going to try to explain it so it doesn't sound like it's a stretch here in what I'm about to say. Turn to Zechariah chapter 9, if you would. Zechariah chapter 9. Let's begin there. Zechariah chapter 9. And I'm going to begin reading in verse 9 here. It says, Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you, and he is just and endowed with salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Has that happened yet in history? I mean, everybody would agree. Rabbinical Judaism would agree that this is a messianic passage talking about the Mashiach. Prominent rabbis talk about it. The Rambam comments that this is talking about the Mashiach. Another rabbi here, Rabbi Elshek, he realizes this is talking about a number of prominent rabbis. Radak was David Kimchi, an 18th century rabbi, very prominent rabbi. Anyway, this is absolutely a messianic prophecy. There's no question about it. And we believe it was fulfilled. Those of us that believe in the Messiah believe it was fulfilled when Yahushua, our Messiah, rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. It happened back 2,000 years ago, almost 2,000 years ago it happened. Let me keep reading here, though, in verse 10. And I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem, and the bow of war will be cut off, and he will speak peace to the nations. And his dominion will be from sea to sea and from river to the ends of the earth. So when this king that's being talked about in verse 9, it says he's going to speak peace to the nations, and his dominion is going to be from the river to the ends of the earth. To the ends of the earth. Has there ever been such a king that ruled to the ends of the earth? And of course the answer is no. And there's kings that ruled empires, but not to the ends of the earth. This hasn't happened yet, of course, because the Messiah, the one that rode on a donkey almost 2,000 years ago that I mentioned, Yahshua, our Messiah, our Mashiach, he's sitting at the right hand of the Father right now. Psalm 110. We're going to take a look at that passage. He came, he died as it was prophesied in Isaiah 53, the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. And where is he at right now? Sitting at the right hand of the Father. There's a story I want to tell you about that passage. But let's keep reading here. In verse 11, and it says, as for you, because of the blood of my covenant with you. Who's he talking about? He's talking about the king that rode in on a donkey, the one that's going to speak peace to the nations. It's going to rule from the river to the ends of the earth. He says, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I have set the prisoners free from the waterless pit. This very day I am declaring that I will restore double to you. That I will restore double to you. Who is this speaking about? The blood of my covenant with you. Could this possibly have been a prophet or a sage or a... No, like I said, it's very clear, and I think most rabbinical scholars, ancient rabbis and so forth would agree this is a messianic prophecy, as every Christian, I'm sure, scholar would agree it's a messianic prophecy. It's talking about the Mashiach. Because of the blood of the covenant with you, I will set the prisoners free. The Messiah came 2,000 years ago, and we're going to talk about that in a later date. We're going to prove from the Tanakh. I'm very anxious about getting into this talk, but there's some things that we have to talk about first, such as the name of the Messiah. But we're going to prove from the Tanakh that Yahshua is the Messiah. Not using the writings of the apostles, but using the Tanakh. That's what the apostles did. When they went around preaching, and we talked about in previous segments, the scriptures that they had at that time was not their letters. Paul didn't go into a synagogue and use the letter that he wrote to Timothy or the Romans or somebody and say, listen, I want to prove to you that Yahshua is the Messiah with this letter I wrote here. Of course, he didn't do that. He used the Tanakh, the writings from Genesis to Malachi, to prove that Yahshua is the Messiah. And we're going to do that too at a later date. But this prophecy here is talking about the Messiah. There's no question about it. Let's back up to Zechariah chapter 3. Go to Zechariah chapter 3. Now I want to read from Zechariah 3 and Zechariah 6, and then we'll go back to Zechariah 9, we just read here. But before we begin reading, let me say this. At the time of Zechariah, Zechariah came out of Babylon, out of captivity from Babylon after the 70 years of captivity. You know, we talked about Jeremiah preaching to the house of Judah for 50 years in Jerusalem, 50 years before they were taken into captivity for 70 years. And then after the 70 years, they came out of captivity, came back to the land, Jerusalem, which is where we're sitting here, and they rebuilt the ancient ruins. They rebuilt the walls around the city, they rebuilt the temple, and so forth, as best as they were able to, as we talked about previously. But the remnant came out of Babylon, and they left after the 70 years, and they came back and built a city. All of Israel didn't come back. Why? Because they had it made there. I mean, it was a good thing they had going there. You know, look at Nehemiah. He was a cupbearer to the king. Look at Daniel, the prominence that Daniel rose up to in Babylon, and his three friends, Meshach and Abednego. They rose up to prominence there. The book of Esther is written during that 70-year period. And look what happened there, how Mordecai was going to try to kill the Jews, and it got turned around. And it was the Jews that took out the vengeance on the people that were trying to kill them. I mean, the Jews rose to prominence while they were in captivity for 70 years. Why do they want to leave that? Why would they want to leave that and come back to a broken down city in Jerusalem? Because this is his land, and it's his. He gave it to Israel, and they wanted to come back and they wanted to rebuild. They wanted to claim their land that the Almighty gave them as an everlasting inheritance. That was the remnant that did that. The people dedicated to the Heavenly Father and dedicated to the land Israel. They came out of captivity from Babylon. They rebuilt the city. So with that in mind, as we go through here, like I said, Zechariah, the prophet Haggai, Ezra, Nehemiah, these were all contemporaries. They all existed at the same time. They all came out of Babylon after the 70 years. So what we're reading here in Zechariah, Nehemiah was there, Ezra was there, like I said, Haggai, the prophet Haggai. And at that time there was a priest named Joshua. The translation, of course, says Joshua. There's a priest that came out of Babylon and came back to the city, and his name was Joshua. And he had a father, and his father's name was Jehozadak. Jehozadak is more, Jehozadak. So Joshua the priest had a father whose name was Jehozadak. That's a fact. And we're going to be reading about him. But I want to suggest to you as we're reading here that this Joshua is prophetically talking about the Messiah, Joshua. It's prophetically talking about the Messiah. And the reason I'm going to say that as we go through here, you'll be able to see this. When they came out of captivity and back to Jerusalem after the 70 years, there was no such thing as a king. A king in Israel did not exist again. It never existed again, unless you want to call King Herod, or King Herod the Great, he was supposedly a convert to Judaism, which he wasn't. That's a whole other story. I mean, he claims to have been. But until King Herod the Great, around around 65 BCE, maybe 65 years before the Messiah, and King Herod, there was no such thing as a king in Israel. Didn't exist. So when we read about the king here, we're talking about somebody in the future. We're not talking about Joshua. And as I mentioned, we'll go through, as I read through here, I'll point this out. But I think you're going to see it as we read through here too, that this is absolutely talking about the Messiah, Joshua. He was prophesied here in Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 1. It says, Then he showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel of Yahweh, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And Yahweh said to Satan, let me stop here a moment. Yahweh said to Satan. Yahweh did not say this to Satan. It's the angel speaking on behalf of Yahweh. Yahweh did not leave his throne. You know, Isaiah tells us that the Almighty is sitting in his throne in heaven, surrounded by myriads of angels that are crying out, Holy, holy, holy. He did not get up off his throne, to come here and have this discourse with the devil. That didn't happen. It's the angel speaking on behalf of the Almighty. You know, for instance, I mean, I think you could relate to what I'm saying here. Let's say the president. I don't want to talk about this fellow in the office right now, but let's say President Bush. Let's say when President Bush was in office, and he sent somebody to Russia to talk to Vladimir Putin or Boris Yeltsin at the time. And Dick Cheney, the vice president, went over there. And Dick Cheney said, this is what we expect of you, and this is what we'd like you to do. And the next day in the paper, you read something like Bush said to Putin, or Boris Yeltsin. Bush said, or America said. Well, it wasn't America that said it. It wasn't Bush that said it. It was Cheney that said it, Dick Cheney. But he was representing Bush. He was speaking on behalf of the President of the United States, who was representing America. So it could have been said that Bush, even though it was actually Cheney doing the speaking, Bush said to Vladimir Putin, or Bush said to Boris Yeltsin, whatever. See what I'm saying? Because they were representatives of the President. Just like this angel is a representative of the Almighty here. So it said that Yahweh said. It wasn't actually Yahweh. It was the angel speaking on behalf of Yahweh. So many times, I'm thinking as I read this, I hear people that really get this confused, and they have the Almighty speak, and the angel speak, and the prophet speak, and it's the prophet and the angel speaking on behalf of the Almighty. Almost always. It's not the Almighty speaking, as in this case here. It's the angel, not the Almighty. Again, verse 2, I didn't mean to get off on that, but so many people I've heard in the past say, well, it doesn't say that. It says Yahweh said to Satan. It does, but the angel is speaking on behalf of Yahweh. So verse 2, and Yahweh said to Satan, Yahweh rebuke you, Satan. So, I mean, if this was Yahweh, Yahweh would say, I rebuke you. It doesn't say that. It's the angel speaking on behalf of Yahweh. Yahweh rebuke you, Satan. Indeed, Yahweh who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is this not a brand plucked from the fire? Now Joshua was clothed with filthy garments standing before the angel. And he spoke and said to those who were standing before him, Remove the filthy garments from him. Again he said, See, I have taken away your iniquity from you, and I will clothe you with vestal robes. The filthy garment worn by Joshua was representative of iniquity. He said, I've taken away your iniquity from you, and I've clothed you with vestal robes. This Joshua was wearing a garment that was representative of iniquity. Verse 5, and then I said, let them put a clean turban on his head. So they put a clean turban on his head and clothed him with garments while the angel of Yahweh was standing by. And the angel of Yahweh admonished Joshua, saying, thus says Yahweh of hosts, if you will walk in my ways, and if you will perform my service, then you will govern my house and also have charge of my courts, and I will grant you free access among those who are standing here. So Zechariah chapter 3, verse 8 now. And it says, now listen, Joshua, the high priest, you and your friends who are sitting in front of you, and indeed they are men who are a symbol. Remember that, we're going to come back to that in a moment. These men standing in front of him are a symbol. It says, behold, I am going to bring in my servant, the branch. So what he's saying is there, he says, these men who are standing before you are a symbol, and he says to these men, behold, I'm going to bring in my servant, the branch. This Joshua here is being described as the branch. Joshua is the branch. The branch is almost always about 5 times. I'm trying to think. Jeremiah 23, verse 5, I believe, is one. Number of times the branch is absolutely talking about the Mashiach. Again, that's rabbinical Judaism teaches that too. Maimonides, I remember, is one that says, describes the branch of being the Messiah, which of course it is. There's numerous passages that say that. Isaiah chapter 4, verse 6, I think, might be another one, talks about the branch. But anyway, this branch here, of course, is talking about the Messiah. Orthodoxy would agree, Orthodox Judaism would agree with that, most of them, a lot of them, and of course all of Christianity would. It's in verse 9, for behold, the stone that I have set before Joshua, and one stone are 7 eyes. Behold, I will engrave an inscription on it, declares Yahweh of hosts. And I will remove the iniquity of that land in one day. We're talking about this Joshua being clothed with filthy garments, the iniquity of the land being removed in one day, a turban being put on his head, given a festal robe. Let's keep reading here. And in that day, declares Yahweh of hosts, every man will invite his neighbor to sit under his vine and under his fig tree. And this is talking about the kingdom, of course. Micah chapter 4, verse 4. Amos chapter 9, you can read that. Verse, I'm not sure the verses, like maybe verse 11 on down. Amos chapter 9. Joel chapter 3 talks about the kingdom. This is a kingdom when every man will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, at peace. Not worried about any enemies coming. He's going to dwell securely under his vine and under his fig tree. So in the days of this Joshua here in verse 9, when the iniquity is removed from the land in one day, it says every man will be invited to sit under his vine and under his fig tree. So like I said, I believe this is messianic prophecy talking about the Mashiach, Yahshua. He's called Yahshua here. Turn to Zechariah chapter 6. Zechariah chapter 6. I'm going to briefly start out in verse 1 here, but I want to jump down because a lot of this is irrelevant here. Zechariah 6, verse 1. It says, I lifted my eyes again, and behold, 4 chariots were coming forth from between the 2 mountains, and the mountains were made of bronze. In the first chariot were red horses, the second chariot black horses, the third chariot white horses, and with the 4th chariot strong dappled horses. And I spoke and said to the angel who was speaking to me, what are these, my master? And the angel replied, these are the 4 spirits of heaven, going forth after standing before the master, the Lord of all the earth. With one was a black horse, of which the black horses were going forth to the north country, and the white horses going forth after them, while the dappled horses went to the south country. Let me skip down here to verse 10, verse 9. Zechariah 6, verse 9. So the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, take an offering from the exiles of Hildiah, Tobiah, Jediah. You see how the I-A-H at the end of all these names? That's pronounced Yah. Yah, that's the shortened form of the name Yahweh, the Hebrew Elohim, the Elohim of the Israel, our Elohim. It's a shortened form. It's put after a lot of Hebrew names, of course, have the Yah at the end. Like I mentioned, Zechariah, Isaiah, all these names. Anyway, so you see the Yah at the end of the names there. And it says, these men, verse 10 again, take an offering of the exiles from Hildiah, Tobiah, Jediah, and go the same day and enter the house of Josiah, the son of Zephaniah. See, the Almighty's name is shortened form Yah at the end of all of these names here, where they have arrived from Babylon. So these men that were spoken of back in Zechariah chapter 3, and it says they're going to be a symbol, Zechariah 3 verse 8, it says the men standing before Yahshua the high priest, it says these men are as a symbol. These men came out of Babylon. I want to suggest they're a symbol of the people coming out of Babylon. And Yahshua, the Yahshua mentioned here, is talking about Yahshua the Mashiach, the one that's yet to come, and that's going to become very obvious, I think, in the next few passages here. So I want to suggest that these men that were a symbol are a symbol of the men, the people, Israel that is coming out of Babylon in the last days, in the days of the Mashiach, in the days of the Messiah. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but look at verse 11 here. It says, take an ornate crown, and take silver and gold, and make an ornate crown, and set it on the head of Yahshua, the son of Jehozadak. Now, I mentioned Jehozadak. There was a Yahshua the priest at this time, alive at this time, and he did have a father, Jehozadak. The word Jehozadak, if it's transliterated, it's Jehozadak, as we just read here, meaning you don't translate it, you bring it into the language, keeping the pronunciation the same, Jehozadak. If you translate this name Jehozadak, translated means Yahweh, our righteousness. I'm going to suggest the name should be translated here, not transliterated. Even though there was a Yahshua at that time who did have a father named Jehozadak, this is prophetically talking about the Messiah and a future Yahshua, whose father is Yahweh, our righteousness. Yahshua, whose father is not Jehozadak, but translated Yahweh, our righteousness. That's what the word Jehozadak means. Keep that in mind. Take an ornate crown, put on it. Take a silver and gold, make an ornate crown, set on the head of Yahshua, the son of Yahweh, our righteousness, the high priest. Then say to him, thus says Yahweh of hosts, behold, a man who is the branch. Speaking of Yahshua, behold, a man who is the branch. He will branch out from where he is, and he will build the temple of Yahweh. Yes, it is he who will build the temple of Yahweh. And he will bear the honor and sit and rule on his throne. Thus he will be a priest on his throne, and the council of peace will be between the two offices. Now, I mentioned here that when they came out of captivity after the 70 years, there was no such thing as a king in Israel at that time, and there wouldn't be for another 450 years after that, until King Herod, which again was not really a king of Israel. He was a vassal king set up by the Roman government at that time. But again, there was no such thing as a king at this time. This could not possibly be talking about this Yahshua that was alive at that time. It could not possibly be talking about him because he wasn't a king. As I mentioned, they had governors at that time. Zerubbabel was a governor. Nehemiah was a governor. The governors were ruling over the people, the remnant that came out to rebuild the city. There was no such thing as a king at that time. This is prophetically talking about a Yahshua whose father is Yahweh, our righteousness. It has to be. It's not an opinion. It has to be, because there was no kings in Israel at this time, nor after this time, like I said, for another almost 500 years. So anyway, this Yahshua in verse 13, it says, he will rebuild the temple of Yahweh, and he will bear the honor and sit and rule on his throne. Thus he will be a priest on his throne, and the council of peace will be between the two offices. He will be a king and a priest. What is a king and a priest after what order? To be a king and a priest is after the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek is mentioned back in Genesis chapter 15, and of course he's mentioned again in Hebrews chapters 5, 6, and 7, I believe. Melchizedek, during the time of Abraham, when he came back after the slaughter of the kings back in Genesis chapter 15, he met Melchizedek. Melchizedek was a king and a priest. The order of Melchizedek, unlike the order of Levi, who was just a priest, the order of Melchizedek was a king and a priest. There's no such thing as a king and a priest in the Bible, ever mentioned in the Bible, or in Israel. Kings and priests, they didn't exist together. You were either a king or you were a priest. You weren't both. But this individual talked about here, this Yahshua, is going to be a king and a priest after the order of Melchizedek, and we'll take a look at more in a moment here. But the order of Melchizedek, again, means to be of the order of Melchizedek means to be a king and a priest. And that didn't exist in Israel. Melchizedek we have in Genesis 15. That's the only one mentioned except for this Yahshua here, which is talked about again in Psalm 110, which we're going to look at in a moment. So I want to suggest to you that this was prophetically talking about Yahshua, the Mashiach, the Messiah, who was going to rule on his throne as a king and a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Not the Levitical order, of course, but after the order of Melchizedek. In verse 14, Zechariah 6:14. Now the crown will become a reminder of the temple of Yahweh to Helam, Tobiah, Jediah, Hem, the son of Zephaniah. And those who are far off will come and build the temple of Yahweh. And they will know that Yahweh of hosts has sent me to you. And it will take place if you completely obey the voice of Yahweh, your Elohim. So it's going to be this Yahshua is going to rebuild the temple. And he's going to do it. Well, here in verse 15, I think this was interesting. It says, and those from afar will come and rebuild the temple. And yet it said Yahshua is going to rebuild the temple. You know, in Solomon's day, who built the first temple? Solomon, we'll say. There's numerous passages we can look at that say Solomon built the furniture, Solomon built the temple, Solomon built the building and so forth. But Solomon did not lift a finger to build a temple. Solomon did not lift a finger to build a temple. He had it built. But because King Solomon authorized the temple to be built and overseen the building of the first temple, it said that Solomon built the temple. When the fact is, Solomon never lifted a finger to build a temple, except to design it maybe and direct and command how it should be built. But he did not do the building. He had it built. But because he authorized it and he's the one that directed his building, it said that he built it. And here we have the same thing here. It says that Yahshua is going to build the temple of Yahweh. When he returns for the 1,000-year millennium, he's going to rebuild the temple of Yahweh. And the exiles are going to do the actual building. But Yahshua, I want to suggest this is talking about Yahshua the Mashiach, who is going to be sitting on his throne as a king and a priest. It cannot possibly, again, be talking about the Yahshua existed at that time, because he was not a king. There were no kings in Israel at that time. It's prophetically talking about the Messiah, Yahshua. Turn, if you would, to Psalm 110. Psalm 110. I want to tell you kind of a humorous story here. It was a highlight of my life, as a matter of fact. One of the highlights of my life. There's been a few of them over the last 30 years. This was one of them. But Psalm 110. We're going to read Psalm 110, verses 1 through 4 here. You know, maybe about 4 years ago, maybe about 3 years ago, I suppose. 3 years ago, there's a prominent Karaite Jew. There's a prominent Karaite Jew here in Israel. Many people watching this know who I'm talking about because I told you his name. I don't want to mention his name in this tape, although I'm tempted to for reasons I'll discuss in a moment. But he's a very prominent Karaite Jew. A Karaite Jew does not believe in the oral Torah. They believe just the written Torah, as we do, just the written Torah. When I first moved to Israel, I lived in a town in Safat, and I went to a yeshiva up there because I wanted to study the Talmud, the oral Torah. How could I say I agree with it or don't agree with it if I don't know anything about it? So I went up there and I spent about 7 months in Safat, and I was attending a yeshiva up there, Orthodox yeshiva. And I learned a little bit about the Talmud, maybe more so than the average person, I'm sure. And anyway, it was very interesting. I don't agree with most of it, of course. I would never recommend that anybody read it. There are some interesting, I want to be careful how I say this so as not to offend anybody. Let me say this about the Talmud. Let me pause here for a moment from what I was about to say. Let me say this. The Talmud is the oral Torah. And what they say is, the Talmud is 30 volumes long. 30 volumes long. And it contains the Mishnah and the Gemara. There's actually two Gemaras. One's a Babylonian Gemara, and one's a Palestinian or the Jerusalem Gemara. Let the helicopter go by here. I'll finish what I was saying. So there's actually two Talmuds. I said this to somebody not too long ago, and they looked at me and laughed like I had no clue what I was talking about. But there's two. The one that's prominently used and the one that's really the only one discussed today is the Babylonian Talmud. It has the Babylonian Gemara. The Gemara is a commentary. It's contained within the Talmud. Again, let me back up. The Talmud is made up of the Mishnah, which is the oral laws, the Mishnah, and the Gemara. The Gemara is a commentary on the Mishnah. But they're all contained in a book called the Talmud. And I don't want to get off on a big discussion of the Talmud. But the oral law, what they say is the Mishnah was actually given to Moshe on Sinai, given to Moses on Sinai. They say he was given the written Torah, which is contained here in the Bible, and he was also given the oral Torah. This volumes of other oral laws that Moses was given on Sinai, which I don't believe for a second, and I think any Jew, if you look into it, any Orthodox, if you look into it, most of you believe it because you want to believe it, not because it's a fact. Because if you look into it, you can prove, and in the writing, there's a book called The Wisdom of the Talmud. The Wisdom of the Talmud. You can get it online, as a matter of fact. You can get the whole book online. It's free, and you can read it. It's a pro-Talmud book. It's not putting down the Talmud in any way, but it's very blatant, I guess I should say, in its definitions and in the way it describes the way the Talmud came into existence, who did it, why they did it, when it was codified, put into book form, when it originated, where these laws came from, when they changed the laws, and a lot of things in the Oral Torah they've changed from what the written Torah says, such as the calendars, for instance, and there's a number of other things we could talk about. Again, this isn't a discourse on the Talmud. I feel like I have to explain this so as not to offend anybody. But in the Oral Torah, they say these volumes of books that were given to Moses at Mount Sinai orally. He was given the written law, which he wrote down, and then he was given these volumes of other laws that he memorized. And he passed on to Joshua, and Joshua passed them on to the judges to the prophets, and then they were codified around the year 2 to 400 AD, so like over 1,500 years after Moses at Sinai. These volumes of laws were passed down orally, like it was memorized by all these people, and they passed it down orally. They never put it into writing. And they were finally put into writing in the year 2 to 400 by the Talmudic rabbis in the year 200 to 400 AD. That's not true, of course. But I believe there has to be an oral law in every community, in every situation, every citizen, every country, every city, every state. There are laws that are like in America, for instance, the Constitution. We have the Constitution, but situations arise in that, so forth, that have to be dealt with that are not addressed in the Constitution. So they had to make amendments to the Constitution. They had to add laws as they went along. And I think the same is true in any community. You could have a set of rules or standards that you live by, but let's say modesty. There's nothing in the law pertaining to modesty. So you have your organization, your city, your group, your religious group, and somebody walks in and they're not dressed in what you might consider to be a modest apparel. You know, maybe they have a real short skirt on, they dress the way so many women today dress, which is an abomination, you know. But anyway, so you have to make a rule concerning modesty now. So you talk about modesty and you set up standards. You say, this is the way you have to dress if you're going to come into this organization or this community or this group or whatever it might be. This is the way you have to dress. If you don't, then you are not welcomed here. That's called an oral. That was an addition to the addition to the law. So you made an oral law now. You made a law. You might have put it into writing, but you added to the law. And I believe that's necessary. There are things like that are necessary. Like, let's say the Shabbat. The Sabbath, we're told how to keep the Sabbath. We really don't need any additional rules. But if you had a community, you may have to add some additional rules. We're told that in the Sabbath we don't do any work. Now, your definition of work and my definition of work might be different. So if we had a community and we were all observing the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week, as we should be doing, we were all observing the Sabbath, you might say, well, I don't think it's work for me to go out and cut my grass on a Sabbath day because I'm not breaking a sweat. Or I can go wash my car on a Sabbath day because I don't look at that as work. And I'd say, that is work. You shouldn't be doing it. And you say it's not. Well, we're going to have to set up a community standard here. We're going to have to say, we're going to have to define work on the Sabbath day. And that's what the Orthodox did. That's not a bad thing, I might add. That's not a bad thing. And if that's the community you live in, and that's the group you associate with, then yes, you have to go by those commandments, those standards that were set up in that community. And that's called the Talmud. That's the Oral Torah. The thing that and there's some things in there that are, the thing that I don't agree with as far as the Talmud is concerned, is they supplanted the written law a number of times. Like I said with the calendar, for instance. And I don't want to get off into it, but they've actually changed the written law a number of times. They didn't just add to it, they changed it. And by adding to it, this is where the mistake comes in. The Messiah, in his day, he condemned them for their oral traditions. Not so much because they were oral traditions. I mean, if you want to set up community standards, that's fine. And if somebody wants to belong to that community, then these are the standards that you have to live by if you're going to be here in this community. But what they've done is, they made it a law. They made their standards a law, a matter of salvation. Now they said if you, well, I don't know, I don't want to get off and start naming things there, but if you violate this thing, for instance, when I lived in Safat for 7 months, a very Orthodox town, it was against the community standards to open an umbrella on the Shabbat. To open an umbrella, if it was raining out, you do not open an umbrella on the Sabbath because you're constructing a roof over your head. That's the way they looked at it. So I wouldn't do that, of course. What they did is they wore their hats and they had plastic on their hats. Because I was in that community, I abided by their standards. But they would say that's a sin if you open up an umbrella. And this is where I have a problem with it. It's a sin. If you continue to sin, you will not make it into the kingdom. And if you're, in your mind you think opening an umbrella is a sin, then it is a sin. Because you're searing your conscience. You're saying this is a violation of the Almighty's commandments by opening an umbrella, which it's not, of course. But if you believe that it is, and you do open that umbrella, then you're searing your conscience, and yes, it does become a sin. That's what the Messiah meant when he said you circle the globe trying to make one proselyte, and you make one convert, and you make him twice a child of Gehenna, or hell, as you are. Because they've added all these laws to the written Torah, all these laws to the written Torah that the Almighty did not put there. And then they start calling them a sin. And that's where the big problem comes in. So like I said, I started to say, so I forgot why I even got off on that subject there. Oh, Nehemiah. So I was talking to this Karaite Jew about the Torah, the written Torah. The Karaite Jews believe in just the written Torah, not the oral Torah, which I believe in the written Torah also. If I belonged to a community that followed oral laws and they had standards, I'd live by those standards. But it's not a matter of salvation. That's the whole point. What I was trying to say is, when you make those community standards a matter of salvation and call them sin, now we've got a major problem on our hands there. But the Karaites don't believe in the Talmud. They don't believe in the oral Torah, and neither do I. Neither do I. I hope I explained that well enough so as not to offend anybody here. And so I was talking to this Karaite Jew, and we got together in a restaurant here, maybe a couple miles about down the road here in Jerusalem, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And I contacted him. Excuse me a minute, to the helicopter going by. So I contacted this Karaite, prominent Karaite. They say there's 34,000 Karaite Jews in Israel. This man's one of the more prominent ones, very well known. Most of you would know him if I mentioned his name, which I'm thinking about it. I'll see if I do before I get done here. But I contacted him and I asked him if we can get together. I want to talk to him about the Torah, the written Torah. I said, I've been keeping it for over 25 years now, and I said, I want to get your understanding on certain aspects of the Torah and how the commandments should be kept. So he agreed to get together, and we did. He was brought up an Orthodox Jew, and then he gave up on the Talmud and he became a Karaite Jew. So we got together and we talked, and I told him, I said, I believe in the Mashiach, but I said, I'm not coming to convert you. I said, I'm coming to talk to you about the Torah. I want to get your understanding on certain aspects of the Torah, the written Torah. So we did that. We got together and we talked for almost 4 hours. And we talked for about an hour or so about the Torah. And I have to say, no disrespect to him, but he didn't add anything to what I understood or knew about the Torah. But I didn't, as a matter of fact, I think he should probably... Anyway, he didn't add to anything that I understood about the Torah, but as we were talking, he said, so you believe in Jesus? And I said, no, I don't believe in Jesus. I said, I believe in Yahshua. I believe in the Mashiach talked about in the Tanakh. I said, the Mashiach that I believe in, the Messiah that I believe in, says that I have to walk even as he walked, in keeping his heavenly Father's commandments, the Torah, the written Torah. The Messiah I believe in didn't nail the law to a tree. The Messiah I believe in is not part of a 3-in-1 Elohim described as a Trinity. He's not the God-man. He's the Messiah talked about and prophesied in the Tanakh. And so he said, I think I can prove that to you if we went through the Tanakh. So this man said, he said, go for it. So we sat there in this restaurant, this Karaite Jew and a friend of his friend's name was Adam. And the three of us sat in this restaurant up here in Jerusalem for about 4 hours. And we were sliding the Bible back and forth. I'm bringing up all these prophetic passages, Psalm 22, Psalm 40, Psalm 16, Isaiah 53, Zechariah 12, Deuteronomy 18. And we're looking at these prophetic passages. And I told this Karaite Jew, I said, do not bring up the name Yahshua. That's the Messiah I believe in. I said, but as we go through these prophecies, you tell me who they're talking about. And don't say Yahshua. We're going to keep him out of this conversation here. But you tell me who these prophetic passages are talking about. Zechariah 12:10. They will look upon him whom they have pierced, as they look upon the only begotten Son, the first begotten Son. Who is that talking about? You know, Psalm 16, Psalm 22, and so forth. And we looked at these passages, and we got to Isaiah 53. And again, I'm telling him, don't bring up Yahshua. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to mention his name, but you tell me who you think these prophecies are talking about. So we got to Isaiah 53, and it was rather interesting. He said, well, this could be talking about a lot of people. I said, well, name them. And he said, well, Jeremiah. He said, Jeremiah was a prophet. Some people think it's talking about Jeremiah. And I said, well, no, it cannot be talking about Jeremiah, because Jeremiah, a number of times, he prayed that the Almighty would bring down vengeance upon the leaders in Jerusalem because of what they were doing to him. He said, Almighty Yahweh, look what they're doing to me. I pray you bring vengeance upon these people. In Jeremiah chapter 11, verses 20 to 23 there, and Jeremiah 15:15, he's praying that they bring vengeance down, Jeremiah is. I said, so he doesn't qualify as a lamb led to the slaughter that opened not his mouth. I said, he was opening his mouth. He was praying vengeance on these people that were just tormenting this poor prophet. It couldn't be him in Isaiah 53. And he brought up another rabbi, Sabbatai Zevi was the man's name. He was a 16th century rabbi who most of Israel at that time thought was the Messiah, the Mashiach that they were waiting for. This is in the 1600s. Sabbatai Zevi was his name. I think I'm saying that right. But he lived in the 1600s. He converted to Islam. So this Karaite Jew brings up him. He converted to Islam. How could you possibly say he was a fulfillment of Isaiah 53? And we laughed, of course. And then he brought up somebody else that I really can't remember who, but somebody else, and we disproved him, showed that he could not be fulfilled, the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. So he went through these three names, and then this Karaite Jew, he looks at me and he says, well, okay, he goes, if that's talking about your Yahshua in Isaiah 53, he goes, where's he at now? Where's he at now? So boy, I tell you, I lit up like a light bulb, and I said, turn to Psalm 110. So we turned to Psalm 110, and we read it. Let's read it here. It says, and Yahweh said to my Elohim. Let me stop there a moment. You see, it says the Lord said to my Lord in your translations. A lot of people get that confused. As I mentioned earlier previously, and we're going to discuss it in a future segment, the word L-O-R-D there in all capitals, that's the Almighty's name. That's not the Hebrew word, the Lord, or Adon, or Adonai. Adonai is my Lord, Adon is Lord. It's not the word Adon. That's the name of the Almighty, Yahweh. It doesn't say the Lord said to my Lord. It says Yahweh said to my Lord, or my Master. It says Yahweh said to Adonai, my Lord. So Yahweh, it's not the Lord saying to my Lord like some people think. It's the Almighty's name. If his name wasn't taken out of his book 6,823 times, people wouldn't be confused with that passage. But because people don't realize his name, they look at this and they get confused thinking it's the Lord said to my Lord. That's not at all what it says. It says Yahweh said to my Lord, my Adonai. Well, look what he says to him. He says, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And Yahweh will stretch forth your strong scepter from Zion. He's going to rule. This master here is going to rule. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will volunteer freely in the day of your power in holy array from the womb of dawn. Your youth are to you as the dew. Verse 4, Yahweh has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. What is the order of Melchizedek? He's a king and a priest. That's the Yahshua that we read about in Zechariah chapter 6 there. He's going to be a king and a priest. Such a thing did not exist in Israel, except for Genesis chapter 15. It's the only time Melchizedek priest is mentioned, except for, again, he's talked about in Hebrews, like I mentioned, chapters 5, 6, and 7 there. But there's no such thing as a king and a priest in Israel, except for Genesis 15, and except for Yahshua in Zechariah chapter 6, who is prophetically talking about the Mashiach, the Messiah. He's going to rule on his throne as a king and a priest. And that's what this prophecy is talking about. Of course, our Messiah quoted this prophecy when he was walking the earth. Sit at my right hand. He said to those Pharisees at his time, how could David call him my Lord if he's David's son? He was proposing a question to the Pharisees there. But this person, this Karaite Jew that I was talking to here in Jerusalem about 3 years ago, I asked him, when he asked me the question, he said, if Isaiah 53 is talking about your Yahshua, he said, where's he at now? And I turned this around and I gave it to him. I slid it to him, and he sat there looking at it. It's only 4 verses here, but he had enough time to probably read it 3 or 4 times. He wasn't looking up from the book. And I was sitting across the table from him, and I was pushing him for an answer. I said, who is this talking about? Pick a name. Don't say Yahshua, though. Don't talk about my Messiah here. I said, pick a name. I said, is this a prophet? Is it a sage, a rabbi? I said, who is it that is sitting at the right hand of the Father, Yahweh, until his enemies are made a footstool? Who is that talking about? And he looked at his friend Adam and he says, what did you ever bring this subject up for? And we all start laughing because he didn't have an answer for it. That's where the Messiah is at right now. The suffering servant of Isaiah 53, He wanted to know where he's at. He's sitting at the right hand of the Father until his enemies are made a footstool. Anyway, that was the highlight of one of the highlights of my life. I'll tell you, I walked out of that restaurant after 4 hours with this Karaite Jew who has a reputation for talking people out of their faith. I wasn't concerned about that. People told me before I talked to him that he has a reputation for talking people out of their faith. He couldn't possibly talk me out of my faith because my Messiah is based on the Tanakh, the same Messiah that the apostles preached about. And from the Tanakh, everything in there prophesied about him is true. Christianity now, over the last 2,000 years, they've changed many things. Many things have been changed, and we're going to talk about them in the future. But yes, you can talk somebody out of that because they're not biblical. They're not in the Tanakh. They're not based upon the scriptures. Like I said, I don't want to mention them now, but we'll talk about them in the future. But that's why this man has a reputation for talking people out of their faith, because their faith is not based upon the scriptures. It's based upon the traditions of men over the last 2,000 years, almost all of which is not found in the scriptures. And we'll talk about that more at a later date. So that concludes the talk for today. And I didn't have a watch to watch this, so I'm sure this went into 2 segments. And I appreciate your being here today. Thank you very much. And again, please write me. Please write me and tell me whether you agree, disagree. If you disagree, tell me. Like I said, if I've taken something out of context, or you feel that I have, or if I've misrepresented something, tell me, and I'll be happy to talk about it here, and we can clear it up. If I'm wrong, I will change. Absolutely, as I have over the years. I believe very strongly in the name Jesus at one time, as we talked about today. I believe very strongly that the Torah did not have to be obeyed at one time. I see today that I was wrong in both of them things. And when somebody presented it to me, as we're doing here, talking about this, I had to give it up. You know, and I had to give it up. A woman was relating a story to me last night, a sister in the faith, how she was just talking to a woman, and she told this woman, when they were talking about the Messiah and about salvation and keeping the Torah, she told this woman, she said, now if you find out what I'm saying is true, which it is true, when you come to see that it's true, it may cost you. It may cost you your fellowship, because they're not going to want to stop using the name Jesus when you can see that that's not the name. When you see the Torah has to be obeyed. If you belong to a church, I can almost guarantee you they're going to ask you to leave. You cannot fellowship with them if you believe that you have to keep the commandments of the Heavenly Father. So it's going to upset your life. When people see that the Sabbath has to be obeyed. I talked to a barber one time. He was giving me a haircut. And we were talking about the Bible. We were talking about the Sabbath. And he could see that what I was saying was true. And this man was intrigued with what I was saying. He said, wow, I've never heard that presented that way before. He said, I see that what you're saying is true. He started keeping the Sabbath day. Saturday, of course, for a barber, was the busiest day of the week. So this man was so excited at the time. He was calling me all hours of the night, asking me questions about Bible passages and so forth. He'd come over to my house. We'd have Bible studies. And then after, I don't know if it was 3 or 4 months, he was losing a lot of money. So one of the last conversations I had with him, he says, you know, I don't think it really matters what day I keep. Because he was losing this money. He said, I'm losing a lot of money now since I start closing on Saturdays, the Sabbath day. He reverted back to that. Why? For the love of money. He set aside the truth being the Sabbath day. He set it aside for his money, for his job, for his mammon. Mammon meant more to him than the truth did. And that's going to typically be the case. As you learn these different truths, your life is going to be changed drastically, possibly drastically. It could cost you your job if you found out you had to quit working on Sabbath day and your job demanded that you did. Is your job, is it more important to you than honoring the Sabbath day? Is your job more important to you than your fellowship? Is the truth more important to you, or is more important than your fellowship or your job or your loved ones? The Messiah said, I came not to bring peace but a sword. He said, I'm going to cause divisions in families. Fathers against mothers, husbands, fathers against sons, sons against fathers, mother against daughters. He's going to bring division. Why? Because when you embrace the truth concerning the scriptures, it's going to cause divisions. That's the sword that the Messiah was talking about. It's going to happen. It's a hard thing sometimes, but we have to go with the truth. You know, I've often said in the past, and this is so true, if I live to be 100 years old, 100 years, a drop in the ocean does not begin to compare to eternity. Such as 100 years does not begin to compare to eternity. Eternity's forever. We should be living for eternity, not this lifetime, but for eternity. So it's true, it's going to cost us things in this lifetime. And it's eternity that we're living for. And our love for him has to be greater than our love for our mothers, our fathers, our sisters, our brothers, our wives, our husbands, of course. Our love for him has to be greater. He said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. No man's ever been set free by believing a lie. What we're studying here today, what we've learned today about the name Jesus, that's true. Messiah was never called by that name. His name is Yahshua. He's going to be a king and a priest. He's going to sit upon his throne as a king and a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Again, thank you very much for sitting here and taking the time to listen to this. I really do appreciate it. If you agree that what I'm saying is true, then pass it on to other people. Send the link to other people. If you disagree with me, write me and tell me why, and we'll talk about it. Again, thank you, and may Yahweh bless you. Shalom.